I guess we'll go ahead and get started.
She said, well, I said, leave her watching. And I
Find my prodigal sister. So since we got some time, any questions about what we have covered so far? We're going to be in chapter 20 today, 20 through 24. This is a momentous day. We are halfway through the class. So it's all downhill from here. Once we get through this lesson, we'll be all downhill. Yes.
Where's everybody Jacob wrestled with God? This one
What's that?
Jacob wrestled with God.
Jacob, that's coming later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're just Isaac. So we got to take them one kid at a time. So
Okay.
pretty much finished with Abraham. We're going to get to Isaac today, and then Jacob comes after. Jacob was Isaac and Rebekah's daughter. So there's my prodigal sister.
her coffee must not be
We'll
right.
get a tardy notice. Okay, so we will pick up here with chapter 20, I think. Yeah, 20 through 24. By the way, just a heads up, next week is probably one of the longest portions that we'll cover. It's 6 chapters. So you definitely want to read ahead for next week. It's going to be a lot in one class. Hopefully we'll be able to get through that. Still adjusting these classes. So chapter 20 is our narrative about Abraham and Abimelech. And this is going to be very familiar to you probably, because if you recall back in chapter 12, we had the same sort of scenario with Pharaoh. Abraham's interaction with Pharaoh. It sounds very, very much like that. And in fact, next week we'll see it again because Isaac will go see Abimelech and has the same sort of a interaction with Abimelech. So first off, just kind of get the setting here. Abraham goes down to Gerar, which is the Canaanite city in the western part of the Negev. You remember that the Negev is that very southern, deserty part of Judah. So he's way down there and western over toward the coast, I guess, probably not too far from there. So if you have read through this, like I hope you have, because I'm going to read the whole text today, what are some differences that you might have picked up on between Abraham's interaction with Abimelech versus his interaction with Pharaoh a week or two ago? You may notice any differences there. There's several pretty striking differences.
For one thing, he was allowed to stay in the land.
Okay, that's right. Pharaoh said, "Get out of here, and go home." And Abimelech says, "Well, make yourself home. Just join us here." So that's one. Anything else anyone noticed? I've got several here to talk about. For one thing, in that first account, there was mention of Sarah's beauty, and that was part of the reason for Abraham doing this. And also, he was a little bit of a coward. He thought he was going to get killed. We don't really get that part of the story in this particular narrative.
I couldn't understand his faith and trust in God in both instances.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And that's one thing I think when we kind of look at this overall, he seems to have grown a little bit. That first time it didn't look very good at all, did it? It's like, come on, Abraham, you can do better than this, right? But this time, he seems to be a little bit, it seems like he's kind of grown from that first experience. In the first account, Abraham really didn't respond to Pharaoh at all, did he? Whereas here, we'll look at that in a minute, he responds to Abimelech's charges against him. And it's interesting that I put a bullet on here that Abimelech may have been morally a little bit better than Pharaoh because Pharaoh was never really told what was going on, right? He saw all these plagues. And so he kind of figured out from the plagues that must be something here for Abraham and Sarah. But Abimelech, God actually came to him in a dream and told him, this is what this is all about. So, and in fact, overall, Abimelech is presented here as being a fairly noble, upright guy, where Pharaoh was not so much, maybe. So those are a few of the differences. Is there anything else here that I missed? Switch glasses here. Just keep going back and forth and not seeing very well. So let's do this. I think we got most of them there. Oh yeah, one last thing. When did Pharaoh give him gifts?
Pharaoh gave him gifts, I guess, after he had received Sarah.
Right, before.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a bride price. It's kind of like, okay, I'm going to buy her from you. Whereas Abimelech gives him the gifts after this has happened. So that's another kind of contrast between the two different stories. And there were evidently a lot of plagues. It just says plagues. It doesn't say how many with Pharaoh. We're only told about one plague here, and that was a plague of infertility. So none of the women in the land could have children. So a couple of other interesting things here in this story is that he talks about, I'm trying to find which verse this is, will you slay a whole nation? Abimelech is kind of asking God, and he gets this vision. Will you slay a whole nation because of this? Does that remind you of anything?
Yeah.
Ring a bell? Huh? Yeah, exactly. It's very much like Sodom. In fact, the word that's used there is the same. It's a word tzadik, which means the innocent. And it's the same word that was used in talking about the people in Sodom when he was saying, will you do it for 45, will you do it for 40, will you do it for 35, and all of that. Also in verse 7, this is just kind of one of those really interesting things. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill innocent people? That's not verse 7, I'm sorry, that's verse 4. Verse 7, now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. This is Moses there, excuse me, Moses. Abraham is referred to as a Navi, which is a prophet. This is the first time the word prophet is used in the Bible. So Abraham is our first prophet. So we don't usually think about him as a prophet, right? We think about Isaiah and all the Daniel and all those other guys. But Abraham was the first prophet. Which reminds me of something I saw on the internet yesterday. Who was the first financier in the Bible? Anybody know? Yeah, you can't say, you know. First financier in the Bible. It's Pharaoh's daughter. She went to the bank of the Nile and withdrew a profit. Sorry. Just had to work that in there. Okay, so Abimelech has three issues that he kind of brings up before Abraham. One is the justice of God. We already talked about that. The fact that you're going to slay the innocent with the guilty. He brings up Abraham's guilt. Why did you do this? You're guilty. Why did you do this? And his own innocence, and that he, didn't really understand at all what was going on. So Abraham actually gives him an answer to those questions. And for one thing, Abraham seems to have assumed that Gerar, remember this is not his local place where he hangs out, he's in a different place than he usually is. He assumed that it's full of irreverent, violent, and lustful men. Now, where might he have gotten that idea from? Sodom, right? What happened to the two angels that were there in a strange place, right? The same thing happened to them. So that's one reason he gave for an explanation. He also here confessed the truth that Sarah actually is a sister. She's his half-sister because she was the daughter of Abraham's brother. So we didn't get that in the dialogue with Pharaoh. So we get a little bit more information there. And in verse 13, he explains that this was a kind of a plan that they had worked out from the beginning. That they would make this story of, so that nothing happened to him, that they would pass her off as his sister, as his sister rather than as his wife. So all in all, Abimelech seems to be a pretty decent guy, whereas Pharaoh, maybe not so much so. Another thing that's kind of interesting here is as it winds up, for one of the few times in the Old Testament, God's people were living at peace in the middle of pagan people. Usually they're going to war every other day, but this seems to be kind of peaceful. So they kind of work things out as we work through this with Abraham and Abimelech. So any questions about that? We're going to go on to chapter 21. This is the birth of Isaac. So now that promise is starting to be fulfilled. It's promised two things, progeny and land. And he had Ishmael, but Ishmael's not the one, right? Isaac is going to be the one. So in chapter 21, if you remember, Isaac means he who laughs. Yicham, he who laughs. And there's a whole theme of laughter in the first part of this, and it's honestly a little bit difficult to understand what exactly is meant. For example, in verse 6, let me just read this. 21:6. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. So, is she talking about good laughter? They're going to be having a feast here in a minute. Maybe it's laughter because they're happy and they're joyous that they have a son. Or is it more of a mocking kind of laughter that other people are making fun of her? How's a 90-year-old woman going to have a baby? How's she going to deal with that as a lady that old? And it's not really clear which one is meant. I mean, it could mean either one. I guess it could mean both in a sense. Yeah. But a little bit later, in verses 9 and 10, we get a totally different take on it. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had born to Abraham, laughing. Now, this is a different word. That first word is the word that we've seen before, the tashak, it is, that means laughs or mocks. But this word means mocks or plays, either one. Mock, kind of scoff, right? And so that's what really leads Sarah to saying, okay, Abraham, get her out of here. I've had enough of this. I'm not going to put up with this. He's there. Send this boy off. And for the second time now, Hagar and Ishmael are sent packing. So this time it's a little bit more clear than it is in the first time when we see it Sarah, where she's saying, people will laugh at me. God has made laughter for me. Everyone will laugh. That sort of thing. So they go off, and it's interesting in verse 12. Look at that one quickly. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac your offspring shall be named. Now, it's interesting that before, when they were sent off, the angel said go back and submit to her. But now, God is telling Abraham, now you listen to Sarah and do what she says. Send them back. And so he does. Kind of regretfully, it sounds like he doesn't really want to, but he does do what God tells him to do. Which is another lesson in it for us, I guess. So a couple of interesting things in different uses of words here between 14 and 15 and 17. How old do you think Ishmael is here? Is he a little boy, big boy, man? How old is Ishmael? Any ideas? In verse 14 and 15, I'm not going to read this, but in 14 and 15, Hagar refers to him as a Yaled, which is a little boy, a lad. A child. But in verse 17, when the angel comes, she refers to him as a Nahar, which is a lad, a more grown-up type of boy. And in fact, if you go back and look at how old Abraham was when Ishmael was born and the time that's lapsed, we know it's been at least 3 years here because Isaac's being weaned, and they weaned for 3 years. So Ishmael is probably 15 or 16. He's not like just some little boy out there. And some of these pictures, I think, are more depict him as being a little boy, yeah, like this. But he's a bigger boy. He's a teenager, for sure. That's just kind of interesting how the Hagar saw him one way, the angel perhaps saw him another way. And this whole story, I think, is really kind of an example of God's grace. Because again, they go out in the desert, and this the one, it looks like he's about to die. And yet, God provides for both of them and tells her that Ishmael is also going to be a great nation. And he has 12 patriarchs, just like Jacob winds up having 12 sons as well. So, God's grace comes through here. And then this chapter ends with this little bit, kind of goes back to Abimelech with this well at what we call Beersheba. I think they probably would call it Beersheba. But this was a well, evidently Abraham claims he built it, and some of Abimelech's people have tried to take it over, and so he gets into a bit of a dispute with him at the end of 21. And they kind of work it out by making a covenant, making an oath there. It's interesting that Beer means well, so that's pretty straightforward. And Sheba can mean either oath or the number 7. And so they did make an oath there, and if you recall in that sacrifice, they used 7 ewes. So it's kind of like a 7-fold oath, if you will. So Beer Sheba, basically the well of the 7 oaths. Kind of look at it like that. And for us, I mean, I've always said Beersheba. That's a common recurring phrase in the New Testament is when they talk about all of Israel, they say from Dan to Beersheba. From Dan, which is way up there in the north, kind of where Mark showed us this morning, up north of Philippi there, all the way down to the desert where Beersheba was. That's just a way of saying the whole land, if you will. So they make that pact, and Abimelech in verse 33, or is this Abraham in verse 33, refers to God as El Olam, the everlasting God. And that Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. So, again, this is kind of like Melchizedek. We got this interaction between a Yahweh worshiper, the only one right now, and a Canaanite king, Gerar. Also, one thing, I should have brought this up several weeks ago when we talked about the different kings that came from the east and warred with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. When we think about kings, we think about like King Charles III, right? Somebody like that. Those were not the kind of kings they were. In that day and time, and particularly in this part of the country, or actually further north in Mesopotamia, what they had were little city-states. They weren't very big places, maybe several hundred people, maybe 1,000 or more. But it wasn't like Nashville or anything like that. So these kings that we read about are really more like mayors, if you think about it. They're kind of over a city, but not a real big city. So just kind of keep that in mind when you hear this thing. Now, when you get to David and Saul and Solomon, now you're talking about somebody that's over an entire country. That is a real king like King Charles III. But back here in the early part of Genesis, we're really talking about guys that don't have a whole lot of power and authority except their little city that they were in. So we might think of them more as mayors. Let's see, anything else on this one? Okay, I think that's pretty much it. With there are some. I think this story also shows us again God's grace. And a lot of times we think about grace as being more of a New Testament thing, but you see it in the Old Testament too. And so right here we see that Abraham and Sarah are rejoicing. They've got a child. Remember, their first promise was you're going to have progeny and you're going to have land. So we're going to see the land here in a few minutes. But they got progeny now. They have their own child, Isaac. I think it's really interesting too that the way God deals with Hagar and Ishmael is that even though they're not part of the promise, even though it's not going to come through them, He still provides for them. He still takes care of them and revives them out there in the desert. And so those that are outside are not rejected by God just because they're outside. They are still covered by His grace. And also, those who are singled out for His favor, it's not for themselves, it's for a bigger purpose. It's really for the other peoples to be blessed, coming down after them. So this wasn't really all about Abraham and Sarah. It was really about all people, even us today, being blessed because of them. So that's a pretty big point too, I think, in terms of demonstrating grace. Okay, any questions on that? So let's move on into chapter 22. This is the sacrifice of Isaac. It's a really interesting chapter. I might read just a little bit of it here since we have some time. This is how we're dealing with this is 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here am I. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. So again, this is kind of like when Abraham left Haran to go down to Shechem. You know, it's just simple faith and obedience. God says, do this. He says, okay, I'll do that. This is his son. This is his only son. This is the one that the promise is supposed to come to. And he's going to kill him. So how is this? He's just got faith that God's going to work this thing out. Somehow. And again, I think for us, when we're in those situations where we don't understand what God's doing, then we just really have to have that faith. He's going to work it out. He's going to make it all work out as it should be. They go to Moriah, and I thought this was interesting. This is something I learned this week. I've always thought that meant he went to Mount Moriah in Jerusalem where the temple is. But evidently, this is a different Moriah because they only traveled 3 days, and it would have taken longer than 3 days to go all the way up from the Negev all the way up to Jerusalem. So it's another Moriah, evidently. Because I remember seeing the Temple Mount, I kept thinking, well, this is where Isaac was offered up. You know, no, it wasn't. So probably a different Moriah.
You wonder what went through Abraham's mind.
Yep.
When he's going to kill his only son. He's supposed to be the seed for these tribes hereafter.
Yeah.
And yet he's going to be dead.
And what might have gone through Isaac's mind?
Well, I was about to say, he said, where's the offering? Where's the burnt
Our
offering?
kids going to be tortured for life from this thing, right?
But it's almost like when God sacrificed his only son.
Yeah. In fact, a a lot of people point that this is one of those kind of forward-looking things, you know, that is a type, if you will, of what is to come. Even the fact that he loads the firewood up on Isaac, and Isaac carries the wood, people say that's analogous to Jesus carrying the cross.
I'm
So-
gonna say that.
Yeah.
Our faith.
Yeah.
Through baptism,
Right.
you know, with the sacrifice of Jesus.
Yeah. So there's a lot of little things here that kind of point forward in that. So he tells him, you know, three things: your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. It's not unclear who he's talking about here, right? He's got four things there. And again, Abraham's saying, well, this is to be the heir. And I'm going to go offer him as a sacrifice. A couple of other interesting things that are kind of, I think, this shows it pretty good. Let's see if the next picture does too. Yeah, both of these pictures kind of, we always have this image of, you know, Abraham's there with the knife right here and Isaac's here and he's just about to thrust it in, and just in the nick of time, God shows up and stops him. Well, that's not really what the text says. The text says he was reaching for the knife when the angel showed up. So, and the other thing, I found this out just from reading some background material, is it wasn't really a knife. The word that's used there is more like a meat cleaver. It's something that we use in butchering, for butchering animals for sacrifice, and slaughtering them. And so, it was a lot more than just a knife. But just a little bit different understanding there. That I always thought, well, he had the knife and he was going to come down and kill him, and it was like that. It's probably wasn't exactly what happened. When he says my father, I'm not sure if I can find this because I didn't write the verse down. If anybody sees it, holler. Seven. Yeah, that's it. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. That's the word that basically is Abba, Father, that we get later in the New Testament, that endearing term of father. And I guess that's where he's questioning him about, you know, where's the sacrifice? Not realizing that he's the sacrifice. In verse 14, we have one of the names of God shows up. Verse 14. There we go. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And so that the word there for God will provide is Yahweh Yireh. So you know, you've probably seen these studies of the different names of God that are in the Bible, and that's one of them. And it comes from the fact that God provided the ram for the sacrifice instead of Isaac. And at the end of this chapter, we have a little bit of genealogy there in 20 through 24 that kind of sets us up for Rebecca in the next chapter. And God provided the ram for him. So, any questions about this?
I have a question.
Yes.
Did you say that the mountain was not the Temple Mount?
No.
It
What
is.
I read is that
Did
it's
you
too
say-
far.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they're in the Negev and they traveled 3 days. They wouldn't have reached Jerusalem within 3 days.
Well, this commentary says it is.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that my whole life. That's why I was kind of surprised. But yeah, this is Bill Arnold in Kentucky, so take the word for it. He's a pretty good scholar. And I meant to get my map out and measure it and see if I could see how far it was and how much you can walk in a day, but I didn't have time to do that.
But if you look at that, you can see that it's such a great distance, you couldn't have covered
Yeah,
it.
it's a long
Because
way.
they didn't have jet
They were
planes.
way down the south. So yeah, it would have been a long ways for them to get up there.
Maybe they had longer legs than we do.
or walk faster, who knows? They all had Fitbits, right? Okay, so at the end of this, we have Sarah's death at Kiriath Arba, which is just another name from Hebron, which Abraham had been living, and you can kind of see here, this is what it looks like today. There's a little monument to her there. It's in verse 4. I think we're in 23 now. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I'm a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. That was kind of a legal procedure, if you will, that they basically took possession of the body in doing that. And so he gets that. And remember that, what were the two promises that Abraham was given? One was progeny and the other was, guess what? He's got land. In 2 chapters, we got Isaac and we got land. So we got both of those promises. They're going to be fulfilled even more going forward, but we have at least the basis of the initial 2 promises that God made to him. Anybody know how old Sarah was when she died? There you go. 127. Good old life, right?
And Abraham was older.
And he was older. That's he's put 10 years older. Yeah. Can you imagine? I don't think I'm going to live that long. Okay, let's see now. Now, 24 is where we get Rebecca. This is the last chapter. This is the longest chapter in the book of Genesis, and actually one of the longest in the entire Bible. Maybe as long as Psalm 119, but it's really, really long. So we're not going to read all of that, but you all, I'm pretty sure you know the story here pretty well of how they're living in Canaanite country, and Abraham tells Isaac, or actually tells his servant, I guess. It's the servant that does the bidding for him. I don't want you to marry a Canaanite girl. Let's go back and get somebody from their family back up yonder. So they go back up to the north country, up in Mesopotamia, to try to find a wife for Isaac, who will be Rebecca. And so Isaac is around 40 years old at this time. So he's still single, 40 years old, needs a wife. He's got to have kids too, right? He's got to have Jacob. So Jacob can have 12. So we got to get this process underway. So this is kind of a typical betrothal scene. The servant goes up there and he just kind of makes this deal with God. Now I'm going to go to the well, and the first girl that comes and gets water, that'll let me know that'll be the girl that's going to be Isaac's wife. And of course, Rebecca comes out, and she's real pretty and impresses him. And also that she offers to get water for the camels. Now, this is something that I learned too, that you might not pick up on, but just the way their land and culture worked back then. Camels drank about 10 gallons of water a day, and there were 10 camels. So she was getting a whole lot of water. Rebecca had her work cut out for her, getting all those camels enough water, to sustain them. So I hadn't even thought about that before, but quite a bit of water there. So then he gives her these jewelry, as a mark, and says, let's go to your father's house. I want to explain to him. They go to Bethuel. Bethuel is really interesting here because he's present in verse 50, but doesn't appear to be in verse 55. Let's look at that just quickly. In verse 50, then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, the thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. So Bethuel appears to be involved in that decision, and yet over in 55, her brother and her mother said, let the young woman remain with us for a while, at least 10 days. After that, she may go. And the thing that's interesting here is this is very aberrant. I mean, in their time and their culture, women did not decide for themselves who they were going to marry. I mean, they actually asked Rebecca, and she agrees. And that was, if you ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, that's the papa's job, to arrange the marriage. And the papa appears to be missing in action in 55. We don't know what happened to him. He's dead, he go away, whatever happened to him. Maybe he's sick. I don't know, but it's interesting that he's there in 50, but he's not there in 55. So something has probably gone on with Bethuel at that point. But of course, they relate the whole story about the trip up there, and he's there to find a bride for Isaac, and they all agree. And so they wind up going back. So this is kind of where they went, way, way up north. This is Mesopotamia, so, just a little bit northeast of the towns of like Ur, the Chaldees, and Nippur, and Erech, and all of that stuff, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers here. So they're way up there, back where Abraham was from originally. That's where they lived before they went to Haran, before they went down to Shechem and into Israel. So this is kind of their home country, and their clans people live there, and that's where they're getting the wife from. It's the Aram of the two rivers, which is the Tigris and the Euphrates, and that includes Haran, the city of Haran, where they had lived before, where Nabal was. So, I know it's a lot kind of quick, and I think we're early. It's only 11. Any questions? Anyone else?
I was wondering if Abraham was the other side where the two rivers came together. Is that where Ur is located on?
Yeah, I think is it over here? Let's see. Here's Haran. You can see it at the very top. Oops, there you go. Blew it up for you. Now I can't see the rivers though, so let me flip that down a little bit. I think if you go to the square box over here, there we go. Now I can't find it. There's Babylon down there. But it's maybe a little bit north of where the two river areas are. It looks like it over here. I don't see the river over here. Here's Haran. Right under the E in Turkey is where Haran is.
So they were originally from between the rivers.
Yeah.
And when he brought them across the river, it'd be just...
Here's the Euphrates, so is the Tigris north of there? So let's see. Yeah, it is between the rivers, because here's the Euphrates right here, so the Tigris would be like up here somewhere. So it is between them.
Right.
It is. And of course, most of early Mesopotamian civilization was a little bit south and west of there, south and east of there, where Ur was, and Erech, or Uruk. The city was called Uruk, the Bible calls it Erech. Nippur, there were like 6 little city-states in there, in and around Babylon. Per se, Babylon was probably the most prominent. And then further to the north and east, you had some of the more Assyrian places like Akkad and other places that were, I guess they were more Semitic too than this. But they're going back home basically to get her for him, and they do that. And next week we will pick up with going forward with Isaac and Rebekah. Any other questions? We have plenty of time. If you've got questions, feel free to shout out. Otherwise, we'll get out a little early since we started early. Everybody good? Okay, so next week, remember, a lot to cover. Maybe I'll start on next week now.
No start over there.
Next week is 25 through 30, 6 chapters. We're going to pick up some speed, but now we're on the other side of the hill, so we're going down toward the end of October to get all through 50 chapters. All right, thank you.
Thank you.